Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Current. This is the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking Webinar Series. My name is Rebecca Power, and I am joining you from the University of Wisconsin. I will be moderating our session today. Since some of you may be new to the North Central Region Water Network, we are an extension-led collaboration among land-grant universities and our partners in 12 upper Midwestern states, and we are pleased to have Tricia Moore and Ron Graber from K-State University with us today to look at how rural and urban watersheds can more effectively work together to address water quality issues. So, we know water is all connected, and as resource use becomes more intensive, we're seeing more evidence of that connectivity every day, where upstream users are impacting downstream users and down on the line. And the big question I think that's facing many of us is how to share responsibility for keeping that water clean, how to see it as a shared responsibility, and how to actually bring our resources together so we can equitably get the job done. So this project that Tricia and Ron are going to talk to you a little bit about today is with the City of Wichita and K-State and farmers that are upstream of the City of Wichita. And they're going to talk a little bit about how they're working to improve the drinking water supply and also to address stormwater management issues in that watershed. And they're also going to tell us a little bit about how K-State is working with and between and among both the City of Wichita and farmers. Before we introduce our presenters, just to tell you a little bit about how this session works. So we will have Tricia and Ron present first, and they'll take between 35 and 40 minutes or so of our hour-long time. While they're presenting, you can submit your questions for them in the chat box, which will show up in the purple Collaborate panel in the lower right-hand corner of your webinar screen. And then we'll take those questions in a dedicated Q&A session at the end. If you're having issues with audio, you can also use our phone-in option that can be accessed by opening the session menu in the upper left-hand area of the webinar screen and selecting Use Your Phone for Audio. As always, this session will be recorded and available at northcentralwater.org and also through our partner eExtension at learn.eextension.org. All right, so let's introduce Tricia, who is an assistant professor in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department at K-State, and Ron Graber, who is an Extension Watershed Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. So you can see them there and see a little bit more about them on this page. They're going to co-present during the session. For those of you that have joined us previously, you know that we usually have 10 or 3 10-minute short presentations. This is going to be one more detailed case that we're bringing you to really highlight this example of how urban and rural components of a watershed can work together. With that, I will hand it off, and Ron, I think you're going first.
Yes, so Ron is having a slight technical difficulty. He's going to call in shortly, though, I think.
Okay, thanks. Then, thank you. Then maybe Tricia, you want to start us off, and then Ron can chime in when he's able to get his audio set up.
Yes, let me do that. So as Rebecca said, Ron and I have been working together with the City of Wichita and within a particular watershed, the Little Arkansas River watershed. And we're both part of K-State, and Ron's position in particular is working for what's known as the Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy, which is Kansas's approach to developing plans and implementing them for water quality and across the state's watersheds. And so this approach, or I'll call it RAPS from here on out, is organized or overseen by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And through that, KDHE EPA 319 funds are distributed and then used as to incentivize producers in RAPS watersheds to implement various water quality practices. And the real thing to highlight with RAPS is that it is a planned approach, and part of that is before going out and distributing funds to identify what some of the priority areas are. So, if we're thinking about sediment or nutrients, what areas of the watershed are likely contributing the vast quantity or the larger contribution of those pollutants, and then trying to target our limited financial resources to those areas. So RAPS is a planning framework, but also a targeted approach. And it's also, the boots on the ground, so between university specialists who are able to work and form relationships with the producers in those watersheds.
Hey, Tricia, I have called in. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. So, Ron, I just covered your first slide.
Okay, wonderful.
Introducing RAPS. So I'll let you take over from here then.
Okay, wonderful. So as we want to give just a little background on the area that we've been working in and our partnerships that we've developed with the City of Wichita. And so here's a map of state of Kansas and showing the Little R Kansas River watershed there in the south central part of the state, just to give you a little bit of feeling for the area that we're working in. If we zoom in a little tighter and just to have a little bit of basic background information on the particular watershed, as you can see the blue line there, the Little Ark River running down through the watershed, Huck 8 watershed, a little over 900,000 acres, very heavily cropped watershed, primarily wheat, corn, soybean, and grain sorghum are our crops that we grow, a fair amount of irrigation as well. As you can see, a pretty substantial number of confined animal feeding operations, most of those being beef cattle operations, and the majority of those would be what we would term smaller operations, ones that are less than 1,000 head. So we do have some that are a little bigger than that, but primarily the smaller kind of farmer feeder operations. Along with that intensive farming, we do, as you might guess, have a fair number of surface water concerns. About half of our stream segments have required TMDLs, and many of those segments have multiple issues. You can see there bacteria, nutrients, sediment, and pesticides as well. The watershed also has a underground aquifer under it known as the Equus Beds, and it is a drinking water source for the City of Wichita and a number of other communities. Also serves irrigation needs in the area and also the industry within the area as well. So we have that interaction. Along with that, we have conditions where that aquifer is fairly close to the surface in many areas. Some cases is close less than 10 feet. So with its being close to the surface and with some fairly sandy, coarse textured soils, we have an opportunity to have some groundwater contamination as well. The City of Wichita embarked on a process in trying to meet their drinking water needs well out into the future. Began looking at a recharge process where they could capture some of the high flows out of the Little Ark River, put
I'm wondering if we just lost Ron here. So he's still listed as a presenter. Ron, we've lost your audio. Tricia, do we still have you? Oh, Ron, can we hear you?
Am I back?
Yes, you are. Great.
Okay, I apologize. I had called in on the phone and not sure what happened, so we'll see how this goes. So the city of Wichita, again, with the Equus-Beds Aquifer, has a recharge project, and the attempt is to capture high flow conditions out of the river and put those back in to get credits for later use. They have the capability of about 40 MGD, and along with this process, then the city certainly has an interest in having that water be as clean as possible, because it does need to meet drinking water standards before they can inject that back. And so one of the issues in our watershed, again, is from a pesticide standpoint, is atrazine. And so if we talk just a little bit about that RAPS project that Tricia mentioned earlier in kind of the initial slide, we organized a group of local stakeholders in the early 2000s and began to look at the watershed and try to address concerns and put together some issues or some areas to address and establish some priorities. And so as a result of that, a watershed plan was written, finished in late 2004. We then in 2011 revised that plan and to address the EPA 9 elements and make sure that we were meeting all of those. And then 5 years later, we began to take a look at that again and revise it. And so we've revised some of our goals. And so that's kind of that RAPS process or watershed planning for the watershed. So the implementation goals that the stakeholder group identified, and this is kind of the order that they chose to try to address those issues. So atrazine was the first issue, and we began kind of putting that plan together in 2005, and in 2006 in earnest started implementing. We followed with settlement in 2010. The other issues listed there, we've not had the time or not had the resources to get at those. So they're there and not necessarily ones that we're addressing aggressively. And so more specifically on atrazine, we want to get to the drinking water standard, 3 parts per billion. And very importantly, try to eliminate those seasonal spikes that we tend to see in the months of April, May, and June that very much coincide with when the city is trying to capture flows to put back into the aquifer for later credits. And then also mentioning the sediment there, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a little bit. So our targeted areas within the watershed, and as part of our 9-element plan, we went in and identified sub-watersheds that were priorities where we thought maybe more significant amounts of pollutants were entering the stream system. So the larger map there on the left would be the atrazine targeted areas. The 2 maps on the right would be the sediment targeted areas with tier 1 on the top and tier 2 on the bottom. And as you can see, again, some of the same areas that have one are identified as a priority for atrazine also are for sediment. Wanted to just identify a few of our partners, and certainly this is not a totally inclusive list, but these are some ones that very much have had significant part in our projects, and the 2 that we're going to focus in on a little more today: Department of Conservation through our Department of Ag, also the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, EPA 319 funds, City of Wichita, Stormwater Advisory Board here in Wichita, and then, of course, K-State Research and Extension. And so let's take a look at the atrazine partnership with the City of Wichita that we've been working on now since 2006. And so early on, when the group identified atrazine as kind of that first issue that they really wanted to go after, picked atrazine because we knew that it was very important to Wichita, and you know, that they had a keen interest in seeing those atrazine spikes reduced. So we talked to the City of Wichita and formed a partnership. They agreed to make some funds available for us to use for incentives. They asked, you know, we initially asked them for $10,000, and then we had $10,000 from our Conservation Commission to match that. So we started out with a pool of $20,000 the first year. We went out and really early on did a tremendous amount of education and just created awareness out amongst the growers, and talked about you know, why it was important that they maybe take a look at how they're using their atrazine, and where they're using it, and those kinds of things, and why they should be concerned about it. And just as importantly, we knew that we had to get the crop consultants and the folks selling the atrazine on board with us as well, because if we weren't pulling the same direction, we'd be dead in the water. So we spent a lot of time visiting with them up front, and really have had good cooperation and support from them in the process. We went in and we identified again some of those even smaller watersheds, and said, okay, we're going to go in and try to do as rapid an implementation in these small areas, and really focus on that, and try to saturate as many acres as we could get. And so we purposely went after larger producers, trying to get a lot of acres in. We set up this in a paired subwater format where we could do some water quality monitoring in our treated areas, and then in untreated areas next to them, so we could hopefully document, yes, we're making an improvement, or no, we're not. And so this is the form that we used. We put together, it was kind of a cafeteria approach sort of thing. Best management practices for atrazine that our university research has said that these are things that will have an impact, and kind of the amount of reduction that we expect to get. And so when we would go and meet individually with farmers, and we very much we identified the growers within these watersheds and contacted them. We had some meetings with them, and then we followed up. We'd go to the farms one-on-one, visit with them in their pickup, in their machine shed, over the kitchen table, anywhere, and had the conversation about the atrazine, and really tried to allow them to pick practices that would fit in their operation. And again, we're talking about 1 year kinds of management things. And then that amount of incentive that they received was based on which practices they chose to implement that year. And so this is the form. As you'll see, we have a higher rate for grain sorghum than we do corn, and we purposely did that, thinking that the timing of atrazine application with grain sorghum would coincide more with when those rainfall events were coming, and where we were more apt to have a runoff issue. So here's a summary slide of participation that we've had through the years, and as you can see, purple would be the amount of dollars that we were putting out there each year, and then the number of acres enrolled in the program. You can see the dollars went up from 2006 through 2011 pretty dramatically. We started out with that pool of 20,000 the first year, then we went to 40,000, then we went to 100,000, and then you see there in 2012 we redirected some of those matching funds that were coming through our RAPS program, or those EPA 319 dollars, and started directing those towards sediment BMPs. And so from 2012 on, the atrazine incentives have been 100% City of Wichita funds. So they are completely funding that, and they've continued to make those monies available every year. And one thing I'd like to point out with that as well is that when these producers sign up and participate in this program, they get a check that comes directly from the City of Wichita. So they know where the funds are coming from. And so you can, again, participation, and we've kind of leveled out on the number of acres. We've seen a big shift away from grain sorghum to a lot more corn, and so that's part of the reason those acres have stayed fairly similar with the dollars basically decreasing. So if we look at the BMPs that producers have chose, and you can see we've got, these are the ones that are the most popular, and kind of as time, and it's interesting, practices that maybe early on were the ones that were more popular aren't necessarily so much anymore. That has a lot to do with the switch from grain sorghum to corn and the Roundup Ready corn, and then the last 2 or 3 years we've seen some shift again, primarily due to Roundup resistant weeds that we can't kill with Roundup anymore. So we've gone back to some little different herbicide packages. So I think one of the messages here is it's we have to remain flexible and be able to work with them to find things that will still get some reduction. So if we look at, have we made any difference? And here's our water monitoring results, and so this would be the 2006 through 2015. 16 and 17 aren't here. Again, we kind of redefined our goals there in 2015 when we were rewriting that RAPS plan, and so we've gone away from the paired study and gone a little different approach, and so that's why there's no water monitoring results after that. But interesting here, you can see that every year we did the paired study, we've been able to document significant reductions in our atrazine levels, and this is we have 15 sampling dates that throughout the growing season, predetermined dates. So they're not biased by any of the weather or rainfall events that may or may not be happening. And then we attempt to capture some runoff events to go along with that. So this would be a number of samples that have gone in there, and varying weather conditions. 2011 was extremely dry. We couldn't get any rain that year. 2009 we had some pretty big flooding events in May, and so that has some impact as well. But I think we've seen been able to document and see a decline in those atrazine levels over time, and I think that's very much related to our activity out in the watershed. Would also like to mention early on when we were collecting these water samples, we were taking them all to campus, running the analysis there. And paying for that with some of those EPA dollars coming through our RAPS grants. When that we reshifted those dollars, and in 2012, the City of Wichita and their lab has they began analyzing water for us. So they've been providing that information to us since 2012. This would just be the main stem of the Little Ark, and we wanted to check Highway 61 would be at the top of the watershed, Highway 50 is kind of in the middle, and Valley Center toward the bottom, just to see, are we having an impact on the main stem of the Little Ark, and our assumption would be that maybe those concentrations would increase as we got lower in the watershed, and I think that generally has been true. And so if we just look in summary at what we've gotten done in that time frame, there's the number of growers, 1,148 growers. The really thing that we've been very pleased with is almost everybody we talked to about this program and participating has agreed to and gone ahead and followed through. So very high participation rate, a little over 200,000 acres of corn and grain sorghum. There's the incentive. If we average that over the entire period, we're averaging right at $3 an acre. Not much money really when you think about a producer making changes in how he uses that chemical and how much and that sort of thing. I like to think of it as an education fee. It's just enough to get us in the door, allow us to have a conversation with them about how they use their atrazine. And then also in that same conversation, we can talk about crop rotations and weed resistance and lead into sediment and other things that have a, kind of a systems add-on approach. If we look at using our effectiveness data and just trying to calculate, okay, based on these BMPs, what would we expect to see the reduction? About 50% based on those calculations. Our actual water monitoring shows that we're reducing a little over 40%. And our annual load reduction over that period of time has been 840 pounds of active ingredient of atrazine. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Tricia, and she's going to talk a little bit about our newer, pretty exciting program that we partnered with the City of Wichita on.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, so as Ron just told you about, one mechanism we have for a partnership between the city and its agricultural watershed neighbors through their drinking water program and wanting to protect their drinking water sources. And so this next project is same idea. I'm hoping to have a more holistic approach to watershed management, but through a different mechanism, this time through the city's municipal stormwater permit. So that's what I'm going to share with you now. So the City of Wichita, just like most other municipalities across the country, is required to obtain what's known as a municipal separate storm sewer permit, or MS4 permit, which basically allows the city and other municipalities to discharge stormwater to streams such as the Little Arkansas River. And so part of the city's permit is that they will implement BMPs or stormwater control measures to address specific TMDLs within the watersheds to which they're discharging. So as Ron shared with you, one of the TMDLs on the stream or pollutants of concern is certainly sediment. And so that is a pollutant that the city has been trying to target by requiring new and redevelopment properties that are greater than an acre as they come online in the city to implement some sort of water quality practices. And so what this has looked like traditionally is that many developers will choose to put in, say, a constructed stormwater pond, such as you see here, or a hydrodynamic separator, which is actually under the ground and kind of out of sight. But both of these practices are popular in the city and serve as a way to remove sediment from stormwater runoff before it's discharged to streams, such as the Little Ark. In about 2013, though, the city brought their Stormwater Advisory Board, and that's SWAB here, together with some prompting from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment to start thinking about another way to maybe address this sediment TMDL in the Little Ark watershed, and that being to potentially form an offsite program. The reason for this is that, again, we all know our economic resources are somewhat limited, and so trying to think of a framework in which we could target those resources to some of the higher priority areas in the watershed and hopefully address water quality issues in a more effective manner. The reason, well, there are two reasons. So thinking about both the environmental and economic effectiveness, but the economic effectiveness of an offsite program in which offsite BMPs could be implemented upstream in the agricultural areas was that as we start to look at some of the costs of these different water quality practices, we can see some pretty large differences. So these slides present a couple of tables based on some work by one of our agricultural economists here at Kansas State. Well, I guess now he's at the Kansas Department of Ag, Josh Rowe, but just to credit his work. But the take-homes here, so in the first table that you can see here, the costs of these different types of water quality BMPs that an agricultural producer might opt to use are sometimes 1 to 2 orders of magnitude less than the types of practices that are used by municipalities, such as the City of Wichita within their municipal boundaries to control stormwater runoff. And some of the main reasons for this difference are, of course, differences in materials and land costs, but really these costs are given on the dollars per ton total suspended sediments removed. And if you look at the sediment production rate in agricultural runoff versus in urban runoff, we're talking maybe a half a ton per acre from an urban area versus in the little arc, some of our higher priority watersheds are generating more on the order of 3 tons of TSS per acre. And so that's where we really start to see some of this economic effectiveness come into play, just from the sediment, the potential for sediment generation in the runoff. And so upon seeing these numbers, the Stormwater Advisory Board as well as the City of Wichita were quite interested in actually moving forward with an offsite program. So that's the point at which I became involved with this project, because we, seeing the economic analysis, wanted to figure out, well, how do we make this type of program work? And so I worked very closely with Ron. Ron and I are partners in this, as you know. We also had some help from Scott Schulte with Vireo Consultants in the Kansas City area, who does some watershed management and land planning. But really, this slide is to show that the major players in putting this program together. So it started with our regulatory players, Kansas Department of Health and Environment, or KDHE, there in the top square, and they were really providing input from a regulatory standpoint. So we wanted to be sure that this program was going to provide the appropriate water quality protections that would be required as part of Wichita's commitment through their MS4 permit. The City of Wichita was, of course, a major player in this, and this slide is intended to outline, kind of the main roles that each of these players have. So as you can see, the City of Wichita is responsible for working with its developers, so another major stakeholder, in communicating that this offsite program would exist, tracking the developments that want to participate in the offsite program, collecting fees, which this arrow indicates. I'm going to come back and talk to that, because that was kind of a major point in trying to develop this program, was determining how much a developer would need to pay, or a landowner in the City of Wichita would need to pay, if they were going to use an offsite BMP in lieu of some of the more traditional water quality practices that we see in cities, again, such as the stormwater ponds or hydrodynamic separators. The next major player is Kansas State University, as well as the RAPS program in the Little Arc watershed. Basically, we come in as the in-between, the City of Wichita, the developers, and then the producers who would actually implement the offsite BMPs. And so the idea is that the City of Wichita can collect an offsite BMP fee from its developers and landowners who want to participate in the program. And then through Kansas State and RAPS, we disperse those funds to landowners in high priority areas. So again, we're working within the RAPS framework of targeting incentive payments to those areas where we have the highest need for water quality practices. And then we keep track of where those payments have been utilized, the types of practices in place to reduce sediments, and then report all of this back to the city, and they can report it back to KDHE as part of their permit and their regulatory obligations. So again, I think the most complex part of this process in operationalizing this offsite program between the City of Wichita and its upstream producers was that figuring out how much, again, what this fee should be. And there were a number of, I guess, considerations in setting this fee. But what we the main considerations were that from a regulatory standpoint, so this was KDHE's input, was that there needed to be some sort of ratio, or we call it here a sediment credit ratio, so that more sediment reduction was occurring upstream than would be produced downstream. And the reason for this is, one, there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know exactly how much sediment is being produced either from a development in the city or from an upstream producer. So this is somewhat of a safety factor, or pardon me, a factor of safety. And then it also helps us account for the fact that we don't exactly know how much of that sediment is ultimately winding up in the Little Ark or other TMDL regulated streams. So in this program, we have a sediment credit ratio of 2, which basically means that for every ton of sediment that would be generated in the runoff from a development in the city of Wichita, they would have to purchase 2 credits of sediment, or 2 tons of sediment offset from a producer upstream. The cost of these sediment credits were based on the cost it would take to install or maintain what we consider to be the most likely type of BMP that an agricultural producer would be willing to implement. And based on Ron's and others' years and years of work working with producers in this watershed, no-till, so transitioning from conventional tillage to a no-till production system, as well as incorporating some intensive crop rotations to keep vegetation or cover on the ground throughout the year, is the most popular BMP that's adopted. And so that's what we based our sediment credit fee upon. The city of Wichita, though, raised a very valid concern with this type of kind of a non-structural type of BMP approach, or a crop management approach, in that it would be more difficult to control the permanency of that BMP. So for instance, we might pay a landowner in 1 year to implement no-till, and then 2 years down the line they might decide to revert back to conventional tillage, and at that point the sediment credits that had been paid for would no longer be valid, and in a sense Wichita would not be fulfilling the requirements of its MS4 permit. And so within the sediment credit fee, we also based some assumptions that we would have some turnover of offsite BMPs, and therefore need to go out and recruit new landowners to replace them, to keep those sediment credits valid. We also included some cost for us, Kansas State, to track offsite BMPs and go out and talk to landowners and get them to enroll in those practices. And so we developed some spreadsheets so the city of Wichita could test different scenarios and get to a comfortable position in what they wanted to charge developers and property owners to participate in the offsite program. Just like with the atrazine program that Ron discussed, we use a very similar sign-up for landowners. So again, I said we based the sediment credit fee on no-till with intensive crop rotations, but landowners would have the flexibility to adopt any other sediment regulating type of BMP, as again that flexibility is important. But through this program we have the ability to pay them differently depending on the amount of sediment that we estimate that their adopted practice would reduce. So again, that flexibility is coming into play as an important factor in this program as well. So just to give you an update, so not only were we able to kind of develop this program, but then the city of Wichita has actually been able to implement it, and it's been running now for about 2 years. And in that time, just shy of, or right around 40% of the new and redevelopment acreage within the city have opted to participate in this offsite program. So through that, they pay a fee to the city of Wichita, which then again comes to RAPS and Kansas State, and we've then been able to enroll enough, about just under 500 acres of cropland into no-till, and saving what we estimate through some watershed modeling to be around 1,600 tons of TSS per year that will not be delivered to the Little Ark River, compared to, again, a much smaller quantity that we would produce to have, or estimate to have been produced in the urban area if they were produced, adopting a more traditional stormwater management approach. So that's, I guess, the gist of our offsite BMP program through the City of Wichita's MS4 permit. And just to tie it up, we have a few keys to success that have been pivotal in both of these watershed partnerships. A lot of them, I think, probably seem pretty intuitive, but I think the main things that I'd like to highlight here before we can move into the questions are just, it's been essential to have a local input and build the trust through education as well as time with these landowners, and that the vehicle we've used to do that in this watershed has been through the RAPS program, so through Ron and others working for RAPS to develop those relationships so that producers are keen to participate in a program that is funded by the city, and also to raise awareness of the city to help them understand how we can develop programs that are likely to be that producers are going to want to participate in as well. The flexibility in allowing producers to adopt water quality practices that meet their needs has also been key. And then in a 30-minute presentation, maybe you don't quite pick up on this, but the time to develop these programs, to develop that trust and give that education has been substantial. And so I think just knowing that these types of programs take a while to develop and being patient with that process is also important. But with that, I guess, Rebecca, I'll turn it back over to you and see if we have any questions.
Yep, great. Thank you so much, Tricia and Ron. And yes, this is our Q&A time. We have a couple questions popping up in the chat box, so we'll get to those first. But if you have a question, please go ahead and submit it in the chat box. So first, Jean asks, is there any atrazine showing up in wells or groundwater, or is this project entirely directed at surface runoff?
Okay, Rebecca, I can take that one. No, to this point we've not seen any in any of the groundwater. It's solely a surface water issue. So that's what we're going after.
Great, thanks, Ron. And then Rima has a question, and it's also related to a question I had. So the question is, did you receive any pushback on either of these projects from the public or stakeholders? If so, how did you manage it? And I'll just say I had a question about the response of developers to the sediment project. But let's first get to the any pushback from the public or stakeholders.
I can take that one as well, or at least make an initial attempt. Let's talk about the atrazine project. We did have a little bit of pushback, and interesting enough, it was from one of the co-ops. You know, I mentioned that we met with crop consultants and you know, the folks that were selling the chemical up front to attempt to get them on board with us, and so we had all of them in a room together, and we had one of the co-ops that just flat said it won't work. And so, you know, that was a little disappointing. You know, we pushed on, and you know, we talked to those growers that were in their service area as well, and got really good response from the growers. And interesting enough, after we'd been in the program several years, the co-op kind of got on board with us, but initially they didn't think it would work and weren't interested in really being a part of it. So I would say from the atrazine standpoint, that was probably the primary pushback. Interesting from our stakeholder group as well. We certainly had some differences of opinion there in terms of, you know, how to put this program in play, and, you know, how much money we should pay somebody in terms of incentives and that sort of thing. And you know, their opinions varied everywhere from, you know, well, if I'm going to do it, I don't need the incentive. I just want you to explain to me why it's important, why I should do it, to on the other complete end of the spectrum of, well, I want as much money as I can get. So we even, you know, even the stakeholder group, it was very much an educational process with them, and, you know, kind of getting everybody somewhat on the same page and in consensus of how to move forward. In terms of the sediment project, a little different issue there, certainly. Not really any from the ag community, I would say. Not really any pushback there. We were looking at practices that we were already incentivizing with some of our 319 money to the RAPS grant, and certainly programs that are similar to what NRCS offers through EQIP and that sort of thing. So not a lot of pushback there. I would say with the urban community, again, it was as Tricia mentioned, it was a long kind of educational process from the time we first began to talk about this as a idea to the point where we really got to a point where we had something concrete put together and were ready to move forward. And Rebecca, in terms of your question about, what about the development community and where were they at? They were very supportive from the word go. In fact, they were really a pusher to get this program in play. And so, from their standpoint, they the amount of money that they or the property owner would be paying in comparison to, doing the traditional, hydrodynamic separator or whatever the case was so much less because, they pay $19 an acre for that urban developed acre, $19 an acre per year. And if we think about those numbers that Tricia put up, and so okay, I can pay $19 an acre, or I can spend $25,000 putting in a hydrodynamic separator and then have a inspection permitting fee and all of that. I mean, from a financial standpoint, it was just a no-brainer for them. And so the development community has been a huge supporter, and I think the urban audience as a whole, I would say, has been very supportive of that project.
And I might just add to that, I think with respect particularly to the stormwater project, we were able to head off maybe some of the pushback by involving those different stakeholders in the process to develop the program. So I didn't really touch on this, but that stormwater advisory board was a major part in providing feedback as we were developing the program, and it was comprised of developers, city municipal workers from the stormwater program, the regulatory community, even some kind of environmental-based NGOs. And so we tried to work with those stakeholders to get their input and see if we could develop a program that could meet needs for them as well.
Yeah, good points. Thank you, Tricia. And another good question from Nicollet County. How was compliance with the BMPs, and these are the ag BMPs that they're talking about, how was compliance with those BMPs determined, and were producers self-policing?
I'll take a stab at that one. We with both of these programs, we have an agronomist that works with us on the RAPS program. We actually contract him for services. A fellow that's lives in the watershed, he's a crop consultant as well. Knows a lot of the guys and has a really good rapport with them. In fact, early on when we brought him on board, I referred to him as our evangelist. But he does the bulk of the contact with growers, farmers, to enroll them, to sign them up. And so with atrazine, for instance, he meets with them during the winter for that following crop season, talks to them about which fields, what practices, does that initial sign up, then goes back and meets with them again later in the season as a follow-up to make sure that yes, they did do what they agreed to. And so he somewhat is policing that the atrazine program. The sediment program works very much the same, where again it's that initial contact, the agreement, the signing of that agreement, and those agreement forms that we showed, the landowner signs those, dates them, as well as Rick, our agronomist. So they both sign those, and that's kind of their contract that says yes, they're going to follow through with it. Those settlement fields, because that does become part of the City of Wichita's MS4 permit. And we need to verify that they're staying in for that 5-year contract period. So we are he's doing most of it, looking at those fields at least annually to make sure that if they and everybody so far has selected the no-till, convert to no-till, and continuous intensive crop rotation. And so we're having that conversation with them. We're looking at those fields at least once a year. The other part of that contract is if they choose to participate in the settlement program, it's required that they follow atrazine best management practices on any year that they might have corn or grain sorghum. And so we're having that conversation with them as well. So we very much are policing those, so to speak, and so far we've not had any issues.
Thanks, Ron. And I think you started to get to Dan Zer's question. I'm going to skip down to Dan's because there's a nice lead in there. It sounds like you two were not the primary people working with farmers, and you explained how that was done. I'm wondering about how you worked with county extension agents and other partners. That's the first part of Dan's question. And then a question also about any sociological survey work beforehand to assess farmers' willingness to participate.
Okay. Tricia and I have not been the main contact people, although when we do educational things, we're very much have been involved in those kinds of group educational meetings, awareness. The individual contact, again, that's our agronomist has done the bulk of that. The county extension agents, the conservation districts, conservation district managers, our NRCS personnel are all part of that RAP stakeholder group. So they attend and participate in all of those meetings and provide input, feedback along the way. They are not necessarily out making contacts with growers or farmers to sign them up, but if they have opportunities to visit with people that are in these areas, then they talk about the program and in some cases then refer them over to us to go ahead with a follow-up visit or contact, and that happens quite a bit. Sometimes those guys may be in the conservation district office and talking about programs, and there may be a program that we offer that fits them, and so they'll send them our way or refer them to us. In terms of the sociological work ahead of time, I guess I would say in terms of the settlement, the offsite program, no, we didn't do anything there. With the atrazine, it was kind of a leap of faith. We had a lot of discussions with the stakeholder group. We talked to those consultants, and we just said, well, let's just start out and see what happens. And we had great response almost from the start. Now, in terms of the settlement, I guess I could back up a little bit there. When we initially started doing settlement work in the RAPS project, it was several years ahead of the off-site program, and yeah, we had some real concerns. Again, having some meetings, and we had a fear that trying to convince guys to switch to no-till or some of those things might not go real well. We didn't necessarily do a survey as such, but we tried to have these meetings and be pretty open and have some pretty open, frank discussions with farmers and get their opinions on, would they be interested and what would it take. So we were doing that back in about 2009, 2010.
Great, thank you, Ron. Let's go to Tom's question now. Was social media outreach used for either project, either in the urban areas or the rural areas?
Well, I guess No would be the answer to that question. We really didn't. You know, and I don't know, you know, we've relied we haven't even used written media a whole lot. We've really relied on that individual one-on-one contact. You know, where we've identified people and sent them direct mailings, and then followed up with phone calls, and you know, and visits to their farms, and that's been the main thrust of how we've made that contact. We, you know, quite honestly, we've probably not done a very good job of telling the citizens of the watershed what we've gotten done. You know, I think sometimes that's one of our failures in extension. We don't talk about some of our successes, but so I guess the answer to the question is no, we really haven't used it much.
Okay, thanks. Well, you're all over Twitter now, thanks to a variety of people that are tweeting about your project and about this webinar. So we're going to give you a little jump start there. And Raisa, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but our last question in the chat box now is, if the atrazine is found in the surface water and not the groundwater, is the sediment filtering it out? So she's asking if the sediment is a sink for the atrazine.
Yeah, I guess yes would be the answer to that. Atrazine tends to be in solution, so it goes where the water goes, and that's, you know, that along with its long half-life is why it tends to be such a problem, because when it does leave a field, it, you know, it goes with that water, and then it ends up in the stream, and you know, once it starts to percolate down through, it generally, I think what we see is it gets filtered out. Now that doesn't mean it couldn't end up in the groundwater, but we've not really, to this point, we've not really seen any issues with it in the groundwater.
Okay, great. Well, we're getting to the end of our time here, so I just want to thank our presenters again, Tricia Moore and Ron Graber. Great, excellent information, great project. And thanks to you all for participating in the current today. If there are folks that you know that might be interested in this topic and were not able to attend, we will have this webinar, as well as others that we've done in the past, archived through northcentralwater.org. Upcoming sessions, October 10th is our next webinar. They're always the second Wednesday of the month, 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern. And Imagine a Day Without Water is an annual event, and we're going to be bringing you some cases where folks were really challenged by the water that they had available or didn't have available, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that. So thanks again so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.